So when we get past Freud, we begin to see shifts, important shifts in psychodynamic thinking. Freud's theories emphasized biological and instinctual drives, things that are almost kind of evolutionary and inherited from when we were still reptiles or apes. It's about the pursuit of pleasure and the discharging of drives and tensions. And the anxieties that we might experience emerge from the id as unconscious material tries to push up into consciousness, and that triggers anxiety. And so in many ways, his model is quite sort of mechanical in a way. It's almost like a steam engine that he's describing, that the mind is a bit like a machine or a steam engine. But the people who came after Freud have tended to emphasize more relationships rather than drives, and have constructed the mind as being relational and understanding psychosexual development in relationship to how we relate to other people and how other people have related to us historically. And it is about the internalization of those relationships. And so early relationships with parental figures then become internalized and serve in a way as templates or models of how we continue to relate to people in adulthood. And so we experience, and the theories focus on, conflicts in these patterns of relationships. And this leads us to Melanie Klein, whose sketch you can see on the screen, who is the mother of object relations theory. And I would suggest that object relations theory in many ways is the dominant or predominant model of psychodynamic practice today, rather than Freudian theories. Although we all reference back to Freud and Freud's work continues to influence us, most people who are practicing psychodynamically are practicing some form of object relations. So I've tried to just sort of do a quick kind of comparison between Freud's work and Klein's work on object relations. So Freud's work centered on the Oedipus complex, so that phase in relation to sexual orientation and the sexual desire for the opposite sex parents and anger and violence towards the same sex parent. Klein, by contrast, centered her work on pre-verbal experiences. So Freud was interested in ages 3 to 5. Klein was really interested in ages 0 to 1 or 0 to 2. Freud argued that drives exist as individualized biological imperatives, so they were instinctual and deeply rooted in the brain. Klein says that drives are complex psychological phenomena that are connected to specific object relations. We'll come back to that term just now, but essentially it's about our relationships with people around us. So the drives are psychological things, not organic or biological, and they are driven in our relationship to other people in the world. Freud says that drives aim to release tension, whereas Klein says that drives have purpose within relationships. So drives seek to draw us closer to people, or to push people away from us, or punish people, or to care for people. Freud also says that drives are diffuse, undifferentiated tensions, whereas for Klein, drives are dynamic structures that have knowledge of objects. And so she gives a lot of credence and a lot of weight to the thinking capacities of even very young children. So very substantial shifts in thinking. So even though we're inheriting from Freud, what Klein does in her work is to take us forward into something that's really quite distinctive and fresh. Klein uses this term unconscious fantasy quite a lot in her work. We spell fantasy with a PH rather than an F because we're wanting to refer to unconscious fantasy. So fantasy with an F is when you imagine somebody that you really are attracted to, who's maybe a film star, and you imagine going out on a romantic date with them. That would be fantasy. The fantasy with a PH is not that kind of fantasy. This is the sort of fantasy that emerges from the id, if you want. It's the fantasy that's in the unconscious and that speaks to our deep desires, not just feeling attracted to some good-looking person, but something that really comes from deep in our belly. So unconscious fantasy is a subjective experience that is informed by and linked with real events. But essentially, the fantasy is something that happens inside of our minds connected to the real world, but located inside of us. So it is not something that's actually happening in the real world. The unconscious fantasy is a mental representation of an inner experience. And by representation, Klein means an image, actually, almost like a film. It's like an internal film that plays out in our mind that reflects an inner experience that is lying a little bit deeper in the mind. And so as a result of that, she would encourage us to listen to the kinds of images that clients present when they express their experiences. So if a client, for example, was doing a drawing, we would be looking quite carefully at what that drawing is about and what's going on in the drawing, because we would think that that is an unconscious fantasy that's being expressed on the piece of paper. In a similar kind of way, dreams are unconscious fantasy. When we can remember our dreams, we're remembering something about the unconscious fantasies that we have in the unconscious mind. So, for example, a hungry baby, if you're a very small baby under the age of 1, you have no verbal skills. You can't say, "Mummy, mummy, I'm hungry, please feed me." The best that a child can do is to cry or to scream, to draw attention to the fact that she or he has a need. And Klein believed that even at a very, very young age, even within the first months of life, babies were experiencing fantasies, images, if you want, almost like movies in their head that were playing out that represented their experiences. So I want you to think to a time when you were hungry. Perhaps you had to skip a few meals, maybe you couldn't afford to eat food, or perhaps you were fasting. At a time when you were hungry, what did that feel like? And try to connect even now with what was that feeling. And I can think times when I'm hungry, my tummy feels like it's twisting a bit. And there's almost like a painful feeling in my stomach as if it's being twisted in some kind of way like that. And it hurts. So a baby who has that feeling in their tummy might have a fantasy that there's some kind of monster in their tummy with very sharp teeth or sharp claws that's sort of scratching at their tummy. And they might feel like something inside of them is trying to tear open their stomach from the inside. And so they would actually have this fantasy, this mental representation, this image in their minds of their stomach being ripped open by a monster that is within. And that would drive a lot of crying, wouldn't it? That would create intense distress in an infant. And so Klein believed that even very, very young babies have these kinds of experiences that are non-verbal, so they're not able to attach words to them, but they have images linked to feelings, linked to physical experiences and relational experiences. And she found this out through her work with children. So she did a lot of play therapy with young children, and through the way that children played and the kinds of images they created and what they did with toys and drawings, she began to develop this insight into early childhood. Klein also speaks about projection and introjection. Projection is the idea that we take some internal experience and we project it out. In other words, we externalize it into the real world. And so when children play, and even adults, when we play, what we're doing is that we are taking unconscious fantasies and we're projecting them out into the real world with the toys that we're playing with or the drawing that we're creating. And so play facilitates projection. It's about taking internal experiences and putting them out into the real world. But introjection is just the opposite. That's when we take things from the external world and we pull them into our mind and into our being. So we introject, we're pulling stuff into ourselves. So early childhood experiences and relationships. So what a child experiences in its early relationship with its parent, its mother, its caretaker, with other people in its environment, all of these internal experiences are introjected and are taken into the psyche and begin to form the ways in which a child engages with the world around them. So they develop internal representations of the external world based on their experiences of the external world. And these internal representations then become drives, if we want, in Freud's terms. They become drives that drive current behavior. So that leads us to this really key concept that Klein developed of internal objects. Hence, her approach to psychodynamic practice is called object relations, because it is about how we engage with these internal objects. So internal objects are internal versions of external relationships. So you may have had a relationship in your early childhood with your mother or a caregiver, and that relationship becomes, which is an external, real-world relationship, becomes internalized. We introject that relationship with our primary caregiver in our early childhood, and that then becomes an internal version of the external relationship. And we develop these internal versions or internal objects of all the people that we have encountered, particularly in early childhood, including those we love as well as those we hate. And these are filtered through projection and introjection. In other words, we may introject the relationship, we take it in, the external relationship then becomes internal, and then we begin to behave towards that external person according to this internal object that we've now developed, and that then shapes how we relate to that person. And so there's a reciprocal relationship between what's happening in the internal objects and the external relationships. These influence each other in a reciprocal way, back and forth through the processes of projection and introjection. Klein also speaks about whole objects and part objects. A whole object is a whole person. An object, remember that when we use the word object, we're really talking about a person, or strictly speaking, a relationship. So a whole object is a whole relationship with a whole person. So your mother or your father or your grandmother or your aunt, whoever raised you, is then the whole object. That whole person then becomes a whole object. A part object is literally a part of that person. So, for example, your mother's face, or your mother's breast, or your mother's tummy, or your mother's hands. These then become part objects. They're a piece of the whole object. And in early childhood, children can't perceive the whole object. They literally cannot see a whole person. Their eyes have not yet developed to be able to see such a big object. And so really what they experience is just a piece of a person. They experience just your face, or just the one breast, or just the other breast. So part objects is what children experience first, and then after a while they begin to then perceive, they have the ability, develop the ability to perceive the whole object. We also tend to split objects into good objects and bad objects. And a classic example of this is the breast. Those of you who have breastfed or know people who breastfed might remember that quite often for many people one breast is quite a generous breast and is able to produce a lot of milk, whereas the other breast tends to be a little less generous and a bit more stingy, if you want. And so for a child, for an infant who's breastfeeding, the breast that produces a lot of milk would be experienced as a good breast because it is generous and nourishing and easy. Whereas the breast that's producing less milk would be experienced as a bad object, as spiteful and resentful and withholding and stingy and mean-spirited. And so these objects, these pieces of these objects, get broken into good objects and bad objects. So the internal objects are shaped by external relationships. So they are formed in reaction to actual experiences with real people in the real world. But they take on, over time, a life of their own. And so even though that parent may go, even though the child might stop breastfeeding, for example, those part objects of a generous and a stingy breast become separate from the external object. They have a life of their own and they become primary. In other words, it doesn't then really matter what the mother's actually doing, because what the child's psyche is grounded on is these objects that have been internalized, the internal objects. Now, in Freudian theory, he believed that objects only formed in the genital phase around the age of 3. But for Klein, she argues that objects, and more specifically part objects, develop from birth. In other words, that from the time the baby emerges from the womb, from the time it opens its eyes and begins to breastfeed or feed on a bottle, the child is already developing internal objects. And so she is really focused on the very first days of life, and especially the first year or two. So Klein developed her own object relations theory stages of development, so the ORT stages of development. And her focus was very much on the first year of life, where Freud had much less to say about the first year of life, except that it was about the oral fixation. And Klein has divided the first year of life into two halves. The first 6 months of life she refers to as the paranoid schizoid position. Paranoid schizoid position, and these refer to the first 6 months, roughly, of an infant's life. And at this stage, the neonate, or the newborn, is psychologically not developed. So the psychological capacities of human beings develop over a period of time during the first couple of years of life. And so an infant at this stage splits the world into black and white, good and bad, generous and stingy. And so the world is really quite clearly divided into these two groups. There's no sense of gray. The capacity to perceive something as being a mixture of things only develops a little bit later. And this dichotomization of the world into good and bad is what we refer to as splitting. So we split the world or objects into good objects and bad objects, and you're either one or the other. You can't be a bit of both. And the technical term in psychodynamic theory for splitting is schizoid. So the word schizoid means to split. And so this is where the schizoid and paranoid schizoid comes. So in these first 6 months of life, neonates or infants are splitting the world into good and bad. And so all sensations are then personified. They become an image or a fantasy, and they're fantasized as good or bad. And so when an infant experiences a need such as hunger, they experience that need as an act of persecution by a hostile agent, the bad object. And we spoke about that in the experience of hunger in the tummy. The first significant object that an infant encounters, usually within the first hour of their life, is the breast. And so the breast is a really important object for most infants. And if it's not a breast, it's the bottle. And so a child, an infant in this stage, will split between the good breast and the bad breast. We've talked a bit about this on the previous slides. The good breast or mother is the one who produces plenty of milk. The bad breast or mother is the one with less milk, or the milk is finished or not available because the mother is perhaps not well, and so or is not producing milk, and so the infant splits the world into good and bad. What's important in this early stage of development is not that the world must be good, 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 but rather that there must be more good to bad. It's the balance of good to bad that's important. There will always be days when a mother is not available. There is very often one breast that is more generous in producing milk than the other. There are times when parents and caregivers are not as emotionally present as they might like to be. And so these negative, bad experiences are not fundamentally traumatizing and harmful to a child, provided the balance of good to bad is still in favor of the good. There needs to be more good than bad. And when there's more good than bad, then children are able to progress through the paranoid schizoid position. So these part objects that we're speaking about, like the breast, are in the infant's experience an extension of themselves. They don't experience the breast as something separate. They experience the breast as a part of themselves. They don't really understand that this is not me, that this is actually my mother or my grandmother or my aunt. They experience it as an extension of themselves through projection and introjection. In the depressive position, which Klein sees starting around the age of 6 months, and so runs in the second half of the first year of life, so from 6 to 12 months, she sees that there is a psychological development in the mind of the child. So the mind begins to develop. And a key part of that development is the recognition that good and bad part objects are actually one and the same. And so the good breast and the bad breast are both connected to one whole object. And this leads an infant, or now a small child, to the experience of whole objects. So I want you to imagine that when the child is a neonate who is very young, is only really able to focus about so far. Their eyes are only able to focus about so far, which is roughly the distance between the breast and the face. And so infants, if you look, will very often, while they're breastfeeding, be looking and gazing at the mother's face, because that's really about the distance that they can focus on. So they're focusing on this distance here. As they grow, their eyes are able to focus a bit further, and it's almost as if the baby now presses back from the mother and realizes that this good breast is connected to the same person who has this bad breast, and that actually these two breasts are part of this whole person, which is called mother. I hope that that makes sense. So initially the baby is only aware of the one breast or the other breast, and doesn't realize that these two breasts are actually connected to the same person. But around the middle of the first year, they begin to perceive visually, but also psychologically, that actually these two breasts are connected to the same person, and so they begin to develop whole objects, not just part objects. And this recognition requires this child to now acknowledge the separateness and the independence of objects. So up until now, the part objects have been experienced as part of themselves. Now they begin to realize that, oh, this breast that I thought was me is actually my mother's breast. And that breast that I've been so angry towards because it's been so stingy and withholding is also part of my mother. And they begin to recognize the mother as a whole object. And this leads to feelings of sadness and guilt and regret for prior aggression. So the anger that was felt towards the bad breast, suddenly the child realizes has actually been directed towards their mother. And the mother is an object of love. And so they realize that they've been hating the object that they love. And this requires them to reconcile love and hate for the same object. So I just want to go back very slightly. When we talked about the part objects, and especially the good breast and the bad breast, the child would love the good breast and want to hold onto it and stay there forever because that's the warm, safe space. But the bad breast, the child would have experienced unconscious fantasies of biting the breast, of tearing it apart with their teeth, of defecating into it, of pooing into it, of destroying the breast. So they would have had really aggressive, hostile fantasies. When you read Klein's work, her imagery that she describes is often very disturbing. To think that an infant could have such kinds of fantasies, such images or films, movies playing in their head. But what happens in the depressive position is that the infant begins to realize that this breast that they loved and this other breast that they've hated and wanted to destroy are both connected to the same person, and they realize that they've been experiencing both loving fantasies as well as very hateful, violent fantasies towards their mother, and that leads to a feeling of sadness and also a fear that they may lose the mother, that their aggression towards the mother might cause her to run away. And so the child might now attempt to repair that damage in order to avoid loss. And this is what leads to the depressive position. So the child becomes, in a sense, depressed. They feel sad and remorseful and regretful for the anger that they've experienced towards the maternal object. So the depressive position is then a really important phase of development. We're talking about the second half of the first year of life. So we're really talking about this infant, this very young child who is not yet talking. In the depressive position, the child has to learn object constancy. In other words, they have to learn that when they can see the mother, they know the mother is there. But when the mother disappears and goes into the next room, they need to learn to know that the mother is still there, that she's constant, object constancy, which of course Piaget has written quite a lot about. The child also has to learn that objects have the capacity to resile or to be resilient in the face of rage and aggression. So the child begins to learn, hopefully, that even though they might have experienced and felt and expressed violence and anger towards the mother for not being perfect, that the mother is able to withstand that and can survive that, and that objects in fact are quite resilient. And this is an important part of early psychological development. But on the other hand, the infant is also learning to appreciate that my behavior can impact on objects, and that when I behave in unpleasant ways towards an object, towards another person, that can hurt them and harm them. And therefore we begin to develop a superego, if you want, that begins to say that this is not an appropriate or okay way to behave. We begin to learn to develop empathy and conscience. It is during this phase also that the child has to learn to deal with sorrow and guilt. Sorrow for their bad, aggressive, violent feelings and fantasies towards the part object, the bad breast, as well as a feeling of guilt when they begin to realize that that's what they have done. And so learning to deal with these difficult emotions is an important part of the second half of the first year of life. We're still talking about a pre-1-year-old. In the depressive position, the infant learns to engage flexibly with complex objects, and so these part objects become integrated into whole, and in addition, the child has to integrate good and bad into whole objects. In other words, the infant has to learn to tolerate ambivalence and recognize the grayness of life, that things are very seldom good or bad, black or white, right or wrong, but are usually some kind of mix of the two, or on a continuum between the two. And this is, in a sense, this ambivalence and the sense of a mixture of things in life is important tasks that a child has to work on during the depressive position between ages 6 and 12 months.